Welcome. It's exciting to be here with you. So about 6 months or so ago, my husband and I traveled to Boston. We stayed in a quaint little hotel in the city. And after a few days at this hotel, I ran out of towels. So I called the front desk and I said, hey, is there a way I can get some more towels? We had a brief chat, and this lovely gentleman told me that now their housekeeping services were opt-in because they cared deeply about being eco-friendly as a hotel. And I thought, okay. And there have been times you might have experienced that as you've been traveling as well. And it seems that companies are really trying to convince us that they care about more than the bottom line. They might pledge to reduce carbon emissions. They might try to donate to various nonprofits. They might match employee contributions. They might try to go green in a variety of ways. They might do one of the more controversial things from a consumer perspective, which is replace the plastic straws with the paper straws. Many of these efforts to do social good fall under this umbrella that academics call, and increasingly business folks as well, corporate social responsibility, or CSR. And we're seeing these initiatives just rise like crazy. So about 20 years ago, we started seeing them happen more and more. And to give you a sense of scale, in 2011, only 20% of the companies that were indexed in the S&P 500 released an annual corporate social responsibility report, whereas in 2020, over 90% of them did. So this is a really big wave that we're experiencing. And some in management literature, organizational research have been calling it the spirituality movement, because that concept of spirituality as well as social responsibility are connected. So organizational spirituality, as an academic term, you can define it as organizational culture guided by mission statement, leadership and business practices that are socially responsible, hence CSR, and value-driven, that recognize the contributions employees make to the organization, that promote individual spiritual development and well-being. So this movement, like I said, is not slowing down. Why is that? Are we, in the US business context, experiencing widespread moral revival? Are businesses all over waking up to the inherent value of biblical virtues of caring for neighbor and the earth? Perhaps. I know that there are business owners who do take these matters very seriously, but if you were to Google CSR, you would be met with many articles about the profitability of CSR. They would be talking about how green investing is a win-win. It's good for you and it's good for the environment. If you think about how donations can help a nonprofit, but they can also help alleviate your tax burden. Some of this win-win language comes through quite a bit. Now, on one hand, that's not that surprising because a lot of research confirms the fact that CSR campaigns are very profitable. In fact, organizational spirituality as a whole tends to have benefits that can be internal to the employees who are less likely to leave an organization because of those spirituality or social responsibility commitments. It can be external in terms of how the brand reputation is perceived by stakeholders. And we're also seeing it having just generally positive effects on overall organizational performance. As Christians, maybe at an individual level, you have also experienced that if you're being obedient to a biblical ethic, that there can be a form of a return. So if you practice self-control, this biblical virtue of self-control, when it comes to your diet and exercise, you might experience good health. When it comes to stewarding your finances well and practicing, once again, self-control in that area, you might experience the earthly reward, if you will, of more financial security. So we know that this can be true in our own life, but we probably also know that sometimes we make really hard moral decisions with no reward at all. Sometimes they actively lead to suffering instead of some kind of return. So that's the big question that we're asking today. Should we expect our investments in virtue to yield an earthly return? And I'm going to address this in a couple ways. The first, we're going to talk about what Christian scriptures and theologians have to say. We're going to start in the Old Testament, move to the New Testament, and address some theologies of suffering. Then we're going to talk about the case study. The case study is of an HVAC supply company in North Carolina that I went down and did a bunch of interviews as well as focus groups, observations, etc., and we're going to look at this in an organizational perspective. Then we'll wrap up with why it matters, although I hope at that point you see that it already does. So let's start in the Old Testament wisdom literature. Proverbs first, to be exact. If you read Proverbs, you might come across lots of references to wealth, prosperity, money, even managing of workers, stewarding resources. So you might come across a proverb like this one. Adversity pursues sinners, but the righteous will be rewarded with prosperity. So you can see why sometimes these texts are an attractive resource if you're seeking like the Bible's business advice. So that's one of the reasons why we're starting here. But if you keep reading, you might also see a verse like this one. A kind-hearted woman gains honor, but ruthless men gain only wealth. So in the first proverb, we have wealth associated with the righteous person, and in the second proverb, we have wealth associated with the ruthless person, which is, albeit, fairly confusing. So if you look at wisdom literature as a whole, a fairly complex view of righteousness and reward and their relationship emerges. But if you look at non-isolated aphorisms, we start to see a clearer picture. Bruce Waltke, in his commentary on Proverbs, talks about how there are many counter-proverbs that nuance the radical thrust of other proverbs by asserting or implying that the doctrine of divine retribution, which is the belief that on earth you will receive some kind of reward for righteousness or punishment for wickedness, also involves divine inscrutability. For some people and for some times, the divine order of retribution seems overturned. The righteous may now live in a topsy-turvy, turbulent world. So to avoid overstating truth or teaching half-truths through isolated proverbs, sages call on their disciples to learn from all of them. And other scholars have noted that there are some proverbs that don't necessarily just nuance these claims of earthly return, but they boldly assert or imply that the wicked prosper while the innocent suffer. This is challenging that reductive act consequence reading of the book, right? That something that I do right now will have a return in the immediate future. And by doing so, these aphorisms also highlight the mystery of divine justice. That gets at the idea of divine inscrutability that Waltke refers to. So in wisdom literature, wisdom is repeatedly referred to as the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is associated with abundant life. So the wise person is fearing the Lord, and they are experiencing abundant life. In biblical theology, abundant life is most closely associated with a relationship with God. That is abundant life. Not necessarily material prosperity or wealth, but relationship with God. So wisdom's reward is God himself in these scriptures. That's what you can take from a more holistic view rather than an isolated proverb. While a complicated picture of obedience and reward emerges from the book of Proverbs, the book's key theme, wisdom, like I said, is most frequently associated with this relationship, and this is on display in another key wisdom literature text, Job. In fact, this question of should I be rewarded on earth for my righteousness forms the very premise of Job. It's the key question the whole story is structured around. Gustavo Gutierrez, in his book On Job, God Talk and the Suffering of the Innocent, says this, and it's a slightly long quote, but it's really good, so just pay attention. The Satan proposes his wager. Lay a finger on his possessions, then, I warrant you, he will curse you to your face. Thus, the central question of the book of Job is raised at the outset, the role that reward or disinterestedness plays in faith in God and in its consistent implementation. God believes that Job's uprightness is disinterested, and he therefore accepts the challenge. The author is telling us in this way that a utilitarian religion lacks depth and authenticity. In addition, it has something satanic about it. The expectation of rewards that is at the heart of the doctrine of retribution vitiates the entire relationship and plays the demonic role of obstacle on the way to God. In self-seeking religion, there is no true encounter with God, but rather the construction of an idol. I know, I've been thinking about this a lot. It'll really kind of seep into your bones. So in the story, Job needs to demonstrate that he loves God regardless of any earthly reward. And if you're familiar with the story, he is increasingly afflicted. He loses his family, his possessions, his physical health. He has this troop of friends who are not helpful. They come to him in his suffering, and they tell him that he must have done something wrong. They actually speak this simplistic view of divine retribution over him, which is, if you are experiencing calamity, you must have done something wicked. This is the cultural view at the time. Job is increasingly enduring suffering, and he becomes more and more miserable, and he's crying out to God, and God's not responding to him. Eventually, he curses the day of his birth. He does not curse God. He curses the day of his birth and says he wishes he were no longer alive. Dan Estes, in his commentary on Job, says that it's in this moment that because Job feels that God has abandoned him, he has lost relationship with God, that God chooses to speak. Because it's vindicating Job's wisdom of wanting the relationship with God more than the material rewards that God had provided him. So in this moment where he feels abandoned, he doesn't want to live because he doesn't want to live without God, God decides to open up his mouth. So not Jesus yet, that comes later. God breaks his silence, but at the same time, Job is chastened. He also gets a hefty lecture from God in the latter parts of the book of Job, some really beautiful poetry. And Job is struck by this sense of, I am so finite in my understanding of who God is and my understanding of whether or not he's going to reward me or not. And he says, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Therefore I despise myself and I repent in dust and ashes. So similar to Proverbs, Job is suggesting the true reward for obedience is life with God. And like Proverbs, this theme is intertwined with that message of divine inscrutability. We see in Job that wisdom also involves humility, a recognition of the finitude of our wisdom and the recognition of God's majesty. So what's the takeaway from these Old Testament wisdom literature texts? The reward for righteousness is life with God. True wisdom is fear of the Lord, especially in light of his majesty and infinite wisdom. So that's the Old Testament. What about the New Testament? Well, it turns out the New Testament is a lot less mysterious. It's quite unapologetic about righteousness and suffering. You get, quotes from Paul's letters like this one. Everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. He says that he wants to know Christ, to know the power of his resurrection and the participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. Then obviously you have Jesus himself, the ultimately righteous sufferer. Russell L. Meek connects the concepts of suffering in the New Testament and to the Old Testament through the person of Jesus. He says, thus, Jesus' suffering is significant for Old Testament theology because Jesus represents the greatest extreme of the unjust sufferer. The one with no sin became sin so that we might be counted righteous in him. If we are to make sense of righteous suffering, then we must take into account the ultimate sufferer. So whereas the Old Testament wisdom literature challenges those simplistic notions of divine retribution, of suffering and reward, in the New Testament, righteous suffering is a theological touchstone. It forms the basis of our understanding of the atonement. Early Christians understood this. They were often persecuted for their faith. They made sense of suffering, according to John Swinton, theologian, with a Christological and an eschatological worldview, meaning they knew that Jesus himself had endured suffering for them. And when they experienced suffering, there was divine solidarity and participation in that. Eschatological meaning, in the coming era, in God's new kingdom, he will remove all suffering. He's promised to do that. So we suffer and we persevere because of these future promises. Early Christians knew this, and Christians whose backs are against the wall understand this. This is a phrase from theologian Howard Thurman, who's talking about oppressed groups, in his case, Black and African American people. If you have experienced persecution, oppression, marginalization, and you're trying to cling to your faith, then a Christological and an eschatological worldview offer not just comfort, but a future hope. So we see this if you look at a womanist theologian, M. Sean Copeland's understanding of how Black Christians have made sense of suffering. She says, "The enslaved Africans sang because they saw on the rugged wooden planks one who had endured what was their daily portion. The cross was treasured because it enthroned the one who went all the way with them and for them. The enslaved Africans sang because they saw the result of the cross, triumph over the principalities and powers of death, triumph over evil in this world." You can see the Christological worldview in there. Christ on the cross. You can see the eschatological worldview in there too. Triumph over evil in this world in the coming age. If this is the understanding of early Christians and many Christians historically, what happened? How did we get here? To quote theologian James Cone, Western theology has been influenced too much by philosophy and too little by the Bible in its analysis of suffering. If you pair this, not just Western theology, which has been influenced by Enlightenment rationalism, which is trying to make sense of this philosophical puzzle. How can God be both great and all-powerful, but all-loving and allow suffering? A classic question when it comes to the problem of evil. Enlightenment rationalism, coupled with increasing affluence globally, historically, and then technological and medical advancement. All of these things together, according to John Swinton, have made suffering seem unnatural to many of us, like an aberration, rather than the standard state of affairs, and especially something to be expected as a Christ follower. Philosopher Odo Marquard calls our modern era the age of distance, the first epoch in which impotence and suffering are not the taken for granted and normal state of affairs for human beings. So what happens? As a result, we assume that life should be pleasant and make sense in the present, and that God should be judged not by future promises, but by God's actions in the present. And if this sounds familiar to you, it's that same Old Testament concept of divine retribution that expects God to act immediately in response to either our wickedness or our righteousness. The view held by the audience of these OT writers that they are challenging as they present these stories like Job. So if we see Christian suffering vindicated in the present life, that's, if we desire to see it, it's not only a break from that Old Testament narrative, but it reflects this Western, global North sensibility that no longer sees suffering in light of the New Testament, the incarnation of Christ, his death on the cross, and the promises of a new kingdom with no suffering or evil. Swinton and others do not hide the harms of this theology. As we've seen, Gutierrez refers to this idea as the demonic obstacle in Job's way. The other day, I came across a quote from theologian Rene Padilla, who talks about this version of Christianity. He says, "The image of a Christian that has been projected by some forms of United States Christianity is that of a successful businessman who has found the formula for happiness. The gospel then becomes a type of merchandise, the acquisition of which guarantees the consumer the highest values, success in life, and personal happiness now and forever. The cross has lost its offense, since it simply points to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for us, but does not present a call to discipleship." I read that and I was shook. We're talking about business people. Padilla's talking about business people. The connection there to this idea of what we're exporting as a form of American Christianity is chilling. How far we have come from that Christological and eschatological view of suffering, so clearly laid out in Scripture. So the takeaway here, there are high stakes for our theologies of suffering and reward. Gutierrez and Padilla, they tell us that they shape whether or not we are believing in the gospel or an idol. And if that's the question, they shape whether or not we believe it all. So if we return to this big question, should we expect our investments in virtue to yield an earthly return? And we look at what Christians, scriptures, and theologians have to say, it's kind of a big old flat-out no. So let's talk about this case study. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about an HVAC supply company. And you might be thinking, oh, Danielle, are you an expert in HVAC? Not at all. I know it surprises you, but it's true. I do study organization, so how did I get connected to this particular company? Several years ago, Wheaton Center for Faith and Innovation, CFI, was doing a series of case studies to try to understand how Christian business people integrate their faith with their business practices. While the director of the center was in Indonesia, they were sending 2 very smart and very eager undergrad women to this case site in North Carolina, and she needed someone to help them with the research component, to collect the data, to make sure that all of our IRB, which is like the ethics review committee, is copacetic, those sorts of things, and asked me if I would go. And I thought, okay, yeah, this sounds fun. At the same time, I was a little nervous. When you study organizations and you study how power manifests in discourse in organizations, sometimes you don't always find very happy or rosy things. And I was a little concerned with these 2 very eager undergrads that I would be a bit of a wet blanket. So let me tell you a little bit about this company before I dive into what happens next. We're talking 80 to 90 employees, 8 retail locations where they're selling HVAC parts, typically to contractors and people who install things like air conditioners. The owner's dad founded the company back in the 70s, and his dad was not a believer, but his son had a really radical transformation in his 20s when he met Christ and decided to take over the family business and change everything. And he did. So we go down to North Carolina. We're going to be doing the observations, the interviews, the focus groups, that's the word, etc. And we're meeting these folks, right, as we're doing all this data collection. And what I found really shocked me. I'm talking to people who came to Christ while they worked there, multiple people who had. Hearing stories about folks working in warehouses, praying for truck drivers who come in to load up for 30, 40, 50 minutes about things that are going on in their life and in their family. Longtime customers who are being visited while they're ill and in the hospital by various members of this organization. Just different workers at this company being called when there's a death in the family and they want some comfort. I was surprised because in many ways, I just saw the fruit of the Spirit. And it's not a perfect company by any means, but I really was surprised that there was just so much evidence of transformation in this otherwise fairly, trying to think of how they would describe it. They refer to themselves as blue collar quite a bit, but not a nonprofit, not a church, and not even like this big corporate budget sort of situation. So as a charismatic, I love a good vision. And I was just seeing this picture of like this big, beautiful flowering plant, like in the middle of a warehouse. So I asked AI to make that for me. And I actually really liked what they came up with. I was thinking more fruit, but I probably should have done better prompt engineering. So I write up our report. Our wonderful Wheaton undergrads deliver it to the leadership. They're great. And again, we're talking about the good, we're talking about the bad, we're talking through recommendations. They're handling it and responding to it very graciously. But the whole time, as we're analyzing the data and I'm reflecting on my time there, I keep coming back to this idea. And this idea is that of tension. That the people at this organization don't necessarily have a clear way of navigating their being in a very ministry-forward, values-driven context that's also for-profit. There aren't many models out there, and so there's this grappling. And there's this ongoing sense-making that they're having to do. So I decided to do a deeper dive of this data after we did that analysis for the company, and I wanted to take a tension-centered approach. Now, to get a little academic, in my field, when we study contradictions and tensions in organizations, we do that because all organizations experience them. So an example would be agency control. How much agency do employees have? How much control is exerted by leadership? What's that push-pull? How do they make sense of it? For a long time in organizational research and management strategy, it was like, how do we find these tensions and like eliminate them? Like, how do we squash them so we can move forward with efficiency? How do we resolve them? How do we fix them? And then over time, folks started to realize, and a lot of folks in my field of organizational comm were like, we're not going to. These kinds of tensions are endemic to organizational life. They're inevitable. We experience them as individuals in our own personal lives, and I'm sure there's a robust theology of paradox and contradiction out there that would talk about how it's baked into our experience as humans. So rather than trying to fix or resolve them, how do we understand them? And how do we come up with strategies for navigating them well? Now, in my field of comm, we kind of add this extra layer, which says how people discursively frame tensions is really important, because how you interact with the tension is shaped by how you wrap language around it. So, I came across this idea recently when I was reading a book. This is just a tension in the wild. This is not related to this company or organizations at all. So 5 months ago, I became a mother. This is Jane. Yes, Jane loves this frog seat for no reason. She sits in it, and she gets so excited she will laugh until she snorts for no reason, other than just sitting in this frog seat. So, like I said, I came across a tension in the wild. Well, I was reading a book because I know that as a researcher, I need to research about parenting, and I also know, deep down, if I just do enough research, I will become the perfect parent. So a friend of mine, that's a joke, a friend of mine sent me this book called Work, Parent, Thrive. And it's actually really great. And the author, Yael Schonbrun, who's a psychologist, writes this whole book to try to get people to think about the roles between working and parenthood and their relationship differently. And she talks about the difference between describing something as work-family conflict and work-family enrichment. So, to give you an example, if I think of my roles as parent and worker in conflict, I'm like, preparing this talk is taking me away from my daughter, right? There's this sense of how do I fill both roles, and there's trying to cope with this competition between them. And she really encourages us to think about it as enrichment, not only because there are ways that we are enriched by both roles, but also because there's a lot of psychological benefits. She's a psychologist. If you think about conflict, you have poorer psychological outcomes. If you think about enrichment, there's a whole host of positive psychological outcomes. And this tracks with the research that I was telling you about before. So work-family enrichment, going back to the example of preparing this talk, is saying, how does my work add to my role as a parent? So for my daughter Jane, thinking deeply about theologies of suffering, I would like her to grow up with a Christological or eschatological worldview. How is she then influencing my talk? Well, she's on this slide, which is great. And then today I was actually reminded in a really real way of how she's influencing me as a worker, because I was preparing this presentation and I was practicing it to my husband while Jane was there. And Jane thinks that you're talking to her if you're talking at all. And she gets very vocal. And when I say vocal, I mean like shrieking. So I am trying to practice this presentation while she is quite verbal. And I thought, you know what? I am developing resilience skills right now. Like if any of you started shouting, I'd be more prepared to address it, coming from an audience member. Like I would be less prone to distraction. That's my thinking. So that's how she's enriching my role in life and thinking as a worker. So that's just a bit of an example for you. So there's 3 different ways that you can make sense of tensions in terms of how you frame them to have different outcomes. The first example is the either-or. That's the example of work-family conflict, right? You have these 2 roles. Sometimes they're just mutually exclusive. The focus is on coping, structurally separating them, like I'm a worker now and I'm not a parent, or I'm a parent now and I'm not a worker. And there can be some benefits to that, but on the whole, this can actually have some negative side effects. And it does often lead to people choosing one role over another. There's definitely times where that makes sense. And you might find yourself thinking, I can't do both of it. I'm not going to be a working parent. I'm just going to be a parent. Hopefully you don't choose to just be a worker and abandon your children. But in theory, it could go either way. So we also see a both and, which is holding those roles together, recognizing that they're enriching. They're interdependent. You might think about it as balance, although sometimes you might shift in which role you emphasize more than the other role. And then the final way of thinking about it is this idea of more than. And a more than framing of tensions transcends the both and, because it's really focusing on not just enrichment, but how do these two roles influence each other in such a way that they are folding into each other and they're creating something new. So a more than transcendent view has to birth something new and creative. So if these two roles are reinforcing, feeding back into each other, blending, and transcending, then you might have an unexpected outcome. So the example I thought of, I actually got from Dr. McGowan, who has written 2 books on theologies of family. So the cool example of creative birth, like new birth here, is the idea of the book, comes out of the interplay between those two roles. Now, not only can this have more cognitive complexity or engaging in more paradoxical thinking, but there can be really creative outcomes, like I said, and other positive, psychologically positive outcomes. So our takeaway here is how we talk about tensions matters. That's what I want us to take away as we go back to the HVAC world. The research questions I had in particular are what tensions emerge in organizational members' descriptions of what it means to integrate faith with business practice, and what strategies are they utilizing to navigate their tensions? Because again, we're never going to fully get rid of them. How do we navigate them well? So what became fairly clear is that this idea of being mission-driven and existing in a for-profit model was so fundamental to this company that it's an ontological tension. If ontology is the study of the nature of being, it is what is the nature of, we'll call this organization CAD, that's a pseudonym that I came up with. What is the nature of CAD's existence? It is so vital to how they make sense of why they exist, who they are serving, and what they do. It's an ontological tension. And you can see this probably best through how they describe their organization itself. They described it as a for-profit ministry. And if that strikes you as a little strange, it's because you're blending that for-profit form, right, typically corporate form, with something that's nonprofit, like a church or a ministry, and you're putting it together. And if it makes you kind of do this, that's sort of what they want. But to give you an idea, the CEO, we'll call him Hank, he said that CAD is a for-profit ministry and compared it to a church. He said, you take a church, what do they got to have? They got to have tithes and offerings, and they got to have more than less. They have to hit numbers. So we're no different. And if it makes you uncomfortable that he's comparing his company to a church, I understand. Just roll with him right now. Then he says, the center of our bullseye is building that work culture where people get up every day and they want to come to work. I talk about it constantly and then glorifying God through that process. So there's something interesting here, because he is saying the center of their bullseye, their mission, is what is driving everything. And as someone who often studies nonprofits, I was struck by how his mission is actually the workforce. It's the people that he employs, the people itself. And in nonprofit context, something that can happen sometimes is that we actually sacrifice the employees on the altar of the mission. And we don't think of them as part of the mission. And here he's saying, my whole mission are the people of this organization. I care about their well-being. That's what it means to be a for-profit ministry. So let's talk a little bit about some of these strategies they're using to navigate this tension. So the driving discourse, how they make sense of it, is like that center of the bullseye idea. It's mission as anchor. We go back to the mission. We go back to the mission. Now, another thing they're doing is engaging in a maintenance discourse, which means how do we make sense of profit? Well, it's keeping the machine running. It's maintaining. So, for example, Hank's assistant, he said, if you aren't in business, you can't use your business as ministry. I mean, if you're not successful on the revenue generation side, if your inventory's all jacked up since you've had business, or you're bleeding cash, and that puts you out of business, any kind of kingdom impact you can have on this side is gone. So these people are developing a language around how to make sense of the fact that they have to drive profit. And this is how they're doing it. They're saying it's maintaining the ministry. That's why we're doing it. The accountant said, going back to the mission as anchor discourse, CAD exists for the eternal significance, not for the profit. That was the accountant saying that. So they have a shared language and understanding of how to do this. they're also using a provision discourse. This is taking the maintenance discourse a step further. And it's saying, why are we maintaining this ministry? So that we can provide for the people who are represented by the employees. And there was a lot of language around feeding families. You're actually getting into this like nourishment context. So if profit has a lot of connotations and it's existing in kind of this secular corporate speak, now we're moving into like food, cozy, family, warm meal language. So we're here to take care of these families, make sure they get fed. What are some of the things that come from this? Like I said, I used the example of Dr. McGowan. The outcome of her more than tension is a book. At CAD, we're seeing this organizational third space. What are they? There's hybridity there. They're not a nonprofit. They are a for-profit, but they're a pretty strange for-profit. We're also seeing very thin net profit for the company. This is very interesting because, again, you can use language to do a lot of things. You could use a more than construction. You can use a for-profit ministry idea to justify all kinds of like hyper lean operations to like grow and maximize and amplify impact, right? Sky high margins, it's for the Lord, right? You could do that. But we're not seeing that play out in the life of this company. We're seeing a really, really thin net profit to the point where one of the CFI staff members I was with was a little concerned. And we asked the CEO about it. He said, I believe when you run a business as a for-profit ministry, it takes a lot of investment financially. I think there are things we do for our people that cost us money. There are services we provide. He lists AAA roadside assistance as an example, which I thought was funny. We do just all these things that cost money. And to put a finer point on it, we kept asking him about that investment. He said he could double to triple the firm's annual net profit if he cut back on those expenses for personnel. What are some of the things that they do? I know you're curious. So they do all the standard benefits things. They're also doing some industry deviant things. They're not doing what other HVAC suppliers are doing. They're doing generous PTO matching for Christian mission trips, flex time, paid volunteer time, that AAA, employee child college scholarships, leadership development training, free financial education programs. And then they're also investing in a department they have called CAD Cares, which is this vehicle for not just serving the employees, but also like engaging them in service work themselves. So they partner with local and global nonprofits. They let employees serve on the clock. They provide an employee chaplain, a Christian resource library, staff family fun days, a benevolence fund, Christian books, a Bible for all new hires, et cetera, et cetera. So they're putting in a significant investment for this sort of thing. And again, thinking nonprofits in my brain, I'm like, this sounds more like an operating reserve that a nonprofit has at the end of the year rather than their net profit. So it's not that surprising that they have fairly slow organizational growth. It's a little hard to fund growth if you are very careful and you are not raking in very much every year. One of the other reasons why they have slow organizational growth is because they adhere to this pay-as-you-go idea. Now, they wouldn't necessarily invest in something until they could earn up enough cash, usually, to pay for it, to like open up a new location or something like that. And when you think about that, it could just be like they're very frugal, but it was more than that. It was because they were terrified of laying off their people by over-leveraging, inducing risk, and then through layoffs, having a form of mission failure. They just didn't want to do that to their people. So like we need to be really careful. And then we see these local level tensions show up. Because one of the things that we see in tension research is that they exist in these nested relationships and these web-like relationships. If there's this larger profit-purpose tension that's hard to navigate, what does that look like in the day-to-day? How do I make resource allocation decisions? How do I make hiring decisions? So we see these local level tensions show up. I'm not going to go through all of them, don't worry. But one of them I call ministry productivity, getting at when do I pray for this truck driver versus when do I think about the fact that I need to be productive in my job. One of the creative ways they work with that is through profit sharing. So if everyone is receiving profit, then they are both motivated to live the mission, but they're also motivated to be thinking about holding that intention. We also see agency control, which I said before. And then finally, compassion accountability. This is the one I'm going to focus in on a little bit more deeply. Compassion accountability. This tension emerged when organizational members struggled to treat employees or customers or vendors with compassion while also holding them accountable to the standards for performance or ethical practice laid out by CAD. So, for instance, Rhonda, their HR director, shared, being in HR, sometimes it can be difficult because Hank, CEO, he's got a huge heart, right? And no matter what a team member may have done, or they could be leaving the company, he just wants to give and give and give. So they're acknowledging his compassion and generosity, even for those who are leaving CAD. So this is the tension, right? When do you show compassion? When do you hold someone accountable? Now, many different participants made sense of this with a both-and discourse, meaning we're compassionate up to a point, and then no more, then we hold them accountable. They're doing both, they're holding them together, it's not quite an either or, but they're recognizing that there are steps they're gonna take, and then they draw the line typically when that employee or that vendor or that customer does something unethical. They will actually fire customers if they find that their customers are lying to them. And they themselves will make sure that if, say, a vendor sends them too much product that they didn't pay for, they mail it back. So they're very interested in making sure that they have this ethics discourse that's keeping them on the straight and narrow, and they'll say things like, I know we're gonna forego profit, but I'd rather be right with God than with other people. Again, they have a lot of fairly robust sense-making about it. Then some other folks were able to engage in more of that more than discourse, and they would use, or more than framing, they'd use a provision discourse. So they're able to fold these into each other. What do I mean? To hold someone accountable is ultimately compassionate. It's ultimately compassionate because if we don't have any accountability, we can't provide for the people in this organization, and that's our mission. Our mission is to provide for the people in this organization. So we have to make sure if people are cheating us, that we hold them accountable. We have to make sure if there's an employee poisoning the work culture, we hold them accountable. We need to do these things because we need to take care of the people here. That's the mission. A couple practical strategies. We're seeing getting the right people on the bus. If you've heard this phrase before, it's because it comes from Jim Collins' management classic, Good to Great. He talks about getting the right people on the bus, getting the right people on your team. And at CAD, this is working as a preventative measure. They want to have high values alignment so that there's less holding accountable in ways that are difficult. They want to make sure that they have this sort of values fit with people in their organization. So they're really careful about their hiring. Now, I told you, that doesn't mean they only hire Christians. It just means they're really intentional about their hiring. The other thing they're doing is crucial conversations training. This is a workplace training that's focused on workplace conflict. Now, I was talking with the CEO, and he said that he became convicted about needing to train his employees better because he said they were experiencing false harmony and it was deadly, which is real, if you've ever felt that. And he needed more tools for helping his employees, his team members, work through conflict in a healthy way. And then because he's really trying to live into this for-profit ministry idea, he's blending these crucial conversations trainings with these Christian values of patience, respect, love. And a lot of people I talk to, and again, it's going to be hard to really measure how much conflict there is, especially if it's latent conflict under the surface. But they said that they have become a lot better at airing things out and also caring for each other as brothers and sisters and treating them with respect as a result of this. So those are a couple of the practical things they're doing to navigate this tension. So let's go back to the big question. Should we expect our investments in virtue to yield an earthly return? We learned from the Old Testament, New Testament theologies of suffering that it's a no. When it comes to this case, what does it teach us about this question? Now, there were some evidence of benefits. So if we think about profit and purpose as mutually reinforcing, what is the purpose doing to reinforce the profit? There is some evidence. We saw very strong employee retention. I mean, these people were there for a long time. They were not leaving their company. It's very costly for an organization to experience turnover. We saw high customer satisfaction, and some employees would say, well, when you treat people like Jesus treats them, they come back for more. And we saw several other benefits, but it is pretty hard to know exactly what those were. They're fairly ambiguous, a little bit harder to track. At least it wasn't my method to go in there with a survey and really try to drill down into what some of those benefits were. But the costs were quite clear, and I was really struck with that and left with that. The costs are very clear, and they're unapologetic about it. In fact, they didn't seem to care that much. Now, they weren't going under. Again, that fear of layoffs was pretty significant. They were growing. There was organizational growth while that CEO had been there. They had grown quite a bit, actually. But again, it's not the center of the bullseye. The center of the bullseye was the ministry component. And meanwhile, the Holy Spirit is at work. So if we return to this slide from before, what do Christian scriptures and theologians have to say? What can this case study teach us? Now let's talk about why does it matter. Another slide we've seen before. There are high stakes for our theologies of suffering and reward. They shape whether we are believing in the gospel or an idol. And that means they're shaping whether we believe at all. In an organizational context, the business case for spirituality, which is saying spirituality is going to boost our profits, that's our business case, echoes utilitarian religion, a la Gutierrez. It's self-seeking religion. This harms people and it harms the gospel witness. If we think back to Padilla talking about the image of the businessman. So even in an organizational context, we're seeing that this harms people and it can harm the gospel witness. Why is that? Because it could become, if you're embracing that business case for spirituality, a form of faith washing. You have this thin veneer of spirituality because you think it's going to lead you to some profit or it's going to increase employee buy-in. But when push comes to shove and the costs become clear and your values piece out, then people know that you weren't all that committed to it to begin with. This can be, in some ways, kind of equated with the business case for diversity, if you've heard that. A diverse workforce boosts productivity and profit. What that does, if you're only hiring diversity to increase profits, that can be very dehumanizing to people who represent diversity. It's not doing it for the inherent value of justice and equity. It's doing it to boost profits. So if you can think of it in comparison to that, if that's helpful. So in contrast to that business case for spirituality, what does it mean for an organization to be disadvantaged for the sake of advantaging others? For owners to forego additional wealth to build the spiritual health of their employees and community? I hope this talk reminds Christians of the importance of true biblical wisdom. Doing the right thing, the sacrificial thing, should not be pursued to simply reap earthly benefits. Righteousness still matters regardless of the ROI. Thank you. I'd love to hear any questions you have. Yeah.
How do they engage differently with their customers?
So they engage differently with their customers in kind of an old-fashioned relationship building way. It was very much, we're just going to get to know them as people. And they'd see a lot of the same customers for years. One of the things that really stuck out to me was that they would put these pamphlets in the doorways of their retail location that would have all of this different information about like existential questions you might be asking about life, right? Why do I suffer? Things like that. And it became clear that at multiple retail locations that the one set of pamphlets that disappeared rather quickly was, I just want to die. And they became really concerned about that. And they would use that sort of thing to help them understand how to get to know and spend time with the people that they were spending time with. They would also do things like they would have free popcorn in every store. They would have like tables and chairs and encourage people to come and sit down and just get to know them. So I would say that's the primary thing, right? It was, they're selling ductwork. It's not like a really complex business model in terms of all the different things they're doing, but they can get to know the people they serve very well.
Thank you, Danielle. Loved it. Do the employees suffer?
Do they suffer in the biblical sense?
Does the company suffer in the biblical sense? Or perhaps, is this just a better version of faith washing?
Oh, well, it easily could be. I don't necessarily...
So just think a little, I'm interested in how you think a little bit more, diving into that.
Yeah. Well, everything should be framed within the limitation of having limited access. And self-report data is going to skew positive in this case because of the questions we're asking and because employees are going to feel like they're put on the spot talking about their organization. Despite all of your promises of confidentiality, that's likely. So I do think that there could be a version of this that is faith washing. I would say, trusting my gut and intuition when I talked to the CEO, he is not interested in that. I think he would be absolutely devastated if he thought that other people thought he was doing that. This really is his passion and his life's work that has completely poured out of his own experience being transformed by Christ. So I don't think that's the intent. Now, intent doesn't always mean impact. But I don't know if it's necessarily true biblical suffering, too. One, because how do you define that? And two, you have shifting goalposts, right? When it comes to what a business needs to be successful, there's different ways of defining that. So if you're cutting into that margin, how much is sacrifice and how much is not sacrifice? It's kind of like, how do you say having too much wealth is too much as a Christian? Is it a certain number? Is it not? It can be hard to actually pin that down. So we're going off of what the people said and recognize to some extent that has its own limitations. One of my students said I'm overly comfortable with long, awkward silences, so if you need to cut me off, you might have to cut me off.
Hello, Dr. Corple. My name is Derek Anderson. My question is, what would you say to someone who wanted to start their own business but didn't have the exact tips to know how to do so?
Yeah.
And how to engage into financial literacy?
Ooh, yeah. And I'm assuming like a Christian business owner?
Yes.
Yeah.
That and a Christian who wants to be known how to invest in the godly way.
Well, investing is a whole other animal. What does it mean to invest in a godly way? I'll leave that question to, we don't have a finance department, but the people in BizEcon. When it comes to starting a business, that's hard. There are increasing networks of people who are trying to struggle this out. And I would say there's actually some really interesting examples in the secular world. The closest I've come to seeing a secular version of this for-profit ministry concept would be Ben & Jerry's. They call themselves a social justice company that makes ice cream. So for them, their social impact is the center of the bullseye. They make ice cream to maintain, like I said before. So there are increasing models out there. I do know that, there's Center for Faith and Innovation, first of all, is a Wheaton internal resource, right? They're talking to all these Christian business owners. They're trying to develop and collate best practices. So while you're here, that's a great first step. And I would say mentorship from people you respect in the space would be really helpful too, as well as looking at existing models in the Christian sphere and outside the Christian sphere. I love your questions, Derek. You always have great questions.
Steve Bretson, business economics, though not finance. I was just wondering, for CAD's customers, do they view them as a Christian business or as just a particularly honest and trustworthy business? Is the full-time ministry more inward focused on the employees, or does the ministry aspect go outside the walls of the company so that others are viewing them and what they're doing because they're Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're very unapologetic about the fact that they're Christian, right? Like their mission statement is build relationships, impact lives, glorify God. Like they're not trying to make it more vague and just ethical principles or moral principles. So you'll see Bible verses places, in their warehouses, in their retail stores. They're also like in the South, which helps a lot. So I think they can be a little bit more upfront and explicit about some of those things. Now, does every customer connect how they're being treated to that Christian mission? I don't know. I would like to maybe survey or interview some of their customers. I got all the data from their customer feedback surveys, and they're kind of off the charts in terms of how customers interact with them. They are, going above benchmarks in most categories. So again, for someone who really likes that business case for spirituality, they'd be like, here, look at this. So I do think that they see them as very honest, ethical company, and it probably varies person to person. But again, they're going to offer to pray for you if you come in and say you're having a bad day. So to some extent, that's not going to happen just at like a moral, honest company, maybe in the same way. They also employ there's a local seminary nearby, and they have like a disproportionate number of seminarians in their warehouses. And so there's kind of this like critical mass of people who are studying theology and who are thinking and talking about these things while they're moving boxes around.
Do you want to come teach my wisdom lit section?
Oh, okay. Well, I think I just had to be vetted by an expert, and hopefully I passed.
That was so great. I have two questions. One, do you view this as a kind of model for Christian businesses? Like, would you present this as like a case study? Or are you like, this is kind of a culture that's developed in a particular location with a particular group of people? And secondly, how much do you think it's tied to the CEO who has crafted this environment? Or is it structural? How long has Hank been there? And do you think that this model will, well, that's kind of speculative, yes. Yeah. Will it survive him? Is it structural or based on kind of the inherent personality of the CEO?
Yes, that's a great question. It's very much tied to him. That's good and bad. It means that he's having influence in a way that leads to lots of, I would say, good outcomes in many ways, but his personality is driving it. Now, I would say his leadership team, for the most part, has been with him for the long haul. So at this point, they are very integrated in their thinking, their speaking. They're all on the same team when it comes to how to implement these things. So I do think that that has a lot to say for like reproducibility as maybe he, moves on at some point. As for it being a model, yes and no. I mean, to some extent, as a qualitative, descriptive researcher, I hesitate to, prescribe. Would love to just continue to describe. And the Faith and Learning Project makes you prescribe in a way that is, deeply uncomfortable to me. Because it's okay, so you did this, empirical study, so, now as a Christian, what do you do with that? How do you make sense of it and move forward with it? I do think there are a lot of things to model. When we gave them a report back to them initially, I pointed out the things that from my disciplinary perspective I thought could be improved, right? And again, we had a really good, honest conversation about that. So I'm not trying to say that they're doing everything perfectly and it's like the shining case study. But because case studies are used a lot in the business world and they can be really helpful, and if I were talking to someone who was trying to figure out how to do this, I would definitely send them to go talk to Hank. I think he struggled it out for a long time and had that sort of, long obedience, long faithfulness in the same direction. Dan.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned that essentially their mission is their people, right? And a lot of that played out in the ways of like materially providing for their people, right? You said feeding families. I guess can you kind of address like how does the spiritual provision play into how they execute their mission for their people? Because you said, hey, you don't have to be a Christian to be hired. So if you could get any kind of context to that, if that makes sense.
So they're very upfront with people who work for them who aren't Christians, that they are Christians. They're going to be given a Bible. They're going to be given so they really love Dave Ramsey. And which relates to their emphasis on pay as you go. And regardless of your thoughts on Dave Ramsey, let's just put that on the shelf for a second. But they pay for all their employees if they want to go to Financial Peace University as a way of thinking about how to manage their money. And they'll do that whether you're a Christian or not. They're like, you should go to Financial Peace University. So they have all these things that they do that they expect employee involvement with, while also being, careful that they're not they're not running into any discrimination laws in terms of workplace discrimination laws. So it's not buyer beware, but this idea, do you know what you're getting yourself into? This is how we operate, and if you're okay with that, then, welcome aboard. But if you're not okay with that, that's not a good place for you, and that goes back to getting the right people on the bus. So they'll just be really, really upfront about that. Does that answer your question? Is it more spiritual nourishment?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if there's any aspect to which the actual evangelism is part of the mission within their employee base. Does that make sense?
Evangelism within their employees or from their employees outward?
To their employees.
Oh. I don't think I asked that question explicitly. Do you evangelize to your employees? I mean, to some extent, the leadership is aware that there are boundaries there. So there was not any explicit talk about and now we go over the Romans road or something like that. That was not ever talked about. I think it was just come immerse yourself in this culture. This is what we care about. And, that means the leadership is going to be asking, what it is you'd like them to pray for you for. They're going to be starting meetings with prayer. They're going to be doing all these things, like I said, very openly.
Hi, Dr. Corple.
Hi, Dr. Haskins.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I really appreciate it. Dr. Alex Haskins in Politics and International Relations here at Wheaton College. Just have a quick question about the Old Testament and New Testament hermeneutics. And I'm not a Bith prof, so I'm not going to go in that direction. But
Me either.
As a prof in poli-sci IR, I often get a lot of students in my classes talking about whether the Bible is, say, pro-capitalist or pro-socialist or something along those lines. And so I'm wondering, you provided a very concrete but potentially also controversial reading of the Old and New Testament. I'm just wondering, how would you convince someone who might otherwise be skeptical that prophet and faithfulness to God, so to speak, are not necessarily as conflictual, maybe?
That's interesting that you think it's controversial, because I was no, you read the Old Testament and it's clear. It's not controversial. But now I'm second guessing it. The New Testament, even more clear, right? You're going to suffer. As to, what kind of economic model the scriptures are prescribing, once again, I will defer to my Bith colleagues and my biz and econ colleagues. I mean, to some extent, I can see how, if you take some of those moral principles that come from, what do we experience that's beneficial to us by living obedient to Scripture, right? There are benefits, like I said, that we get from being obedient to Scripture. I do not think that has anything to do with a particular economic model. I think that you could do that in several different kinds of societies with different economic structures. I don't think it necessarily means that it has to necessarily look a certain way. I do think that if you take your like classic Friedman doctrine, right? So famous University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman famously said that the only social responsibility a firm has is to maximize shareholder value. I would say this is me personally, I think that's anti-biblical. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because I think that that encourages this kind of corporate greed, which is antithetical to Christian virtue, right? I think that it really can quickly become that. I shouldn't say unilaterally it's that, but I think it just so quickly becomes that. And you have the sickness of short-termism, like how do we make results happen so quickly? You're trying to just have investors get kickbacks as soon as possible. And a lot of people in this space are like, well, this is why we're having lots of environmental problems. This is why we're having lots of, labor law problems in terms of, pick your labor ethical issue. So I think that it can so quickly become anti-biblical that like a hyper-greedy capitalistic view, I think personally that's kind of hard to substantiate from Scripture. But once again, I'm not a theologian. It's stretching that in Faith and Learning we have to do this.
John Walton, Old Testament.
Hello.
You're correct. It's not controversial. It's only misread through confirmation bias. Anyway, but that's not my question. So it seems to me that there's a middle territory that you haven't addressed, and I'm wondering what you would comment about this. I mean, here you've got a Christian company and trying to do its Christian thing within its environment, corporate environment. And you talked about the companies at the beginning that kind of go green because they think that that's going to improve their profit line. So I'm aware of a businessman who formed a consulting company to try to advise the regular secular companies in how they can be more successful. And he did it by advising them in strategies where they could nurture a virtuous environment. It included things like you mentioned, that you should pay more attention to your employees than to your customers. If your employees are doing well with what they're doing, that's going to bleed over. And so he advises, public utility companies, things of that sort, that just trying to give them these business strategies. So these clearly are not Christian companies trying to bring about a Christian environment, but rather nurturing virtuous environments with similar strategies not to improve their bottom line profit, but to improve their overall success as a company. I'm just wondering if you have some comments about that kind of middle ground.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we should all want more ethical companies, whether or not they're Christians or not. We should want people running businesses, employed in businesses, who care about neighbor and the environment. So to some extent, I don't want it to sound like we should discourage the implementation of these virtues in an organizational setting. I'm more concerned about using them as this kind of like nefarious smokescreen for unethical behavior. Because one of the things that happens with CSR is this idea of moral licensing. And moral licensing is that if you do one little nice thing over here, you kind of feel okay about maybe not really cutting, the massive carbon emissions or whatever it is that your company is responsible for, because you got rid of plastic straws. So this moral licensing idea is very real when it comes to virtues. And so I think we just need to be really careful. And I don't think we should ever promise people that, if you do things ethically, it's all going to be amazing for you. I think that to some extent there will come times where it really comes at a cost. But at the same time, I don't think that means we should discourage people from doing it either. I think we just need to be more clear-eyed, right? Put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to invest in this, invest in it. It's going to cost money. You're not doing it to just boost profits. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do, or you care really deeply about your employees, and therefore performance in your mind is how well your organizational health, how well you can take care of the health in your organization. So it is a muddy middle, but I just want to make sure that to some extent, we do want virtuous companies, but we don't want companies pretending to be virtuous when they're actually not. And a lot of times that's what CSR becomes. Yeah.
Dr. Corple, thank you for sharing. My question is, based on this case study, you observed that this company was kind of able to succeed because they poured some of their profits back into their employees, which was their goal. So given that, how would you advise like a Christian nonprofit who has to use the money that they do have for outside sources other than their employees?
Yes, well, a lot of nonprofits are using their money for outside sources in terms of they are serving a population or they're serving some cause. And like I said before, they probably could put more money toward their employees. And so at first I would say, are you considering your own people part of your mission? Sometimes nonprofits, they have this like unspoken assumption that you're going to take a vow of poverty when you work there. And I've even heard it said that that's because you need to be like maybe people who are living in poverty. And to some extent that makes sense, but it can become, again, that nefarious thing where it's like, we're going to say this, we don't have to pay you that much. We're going to come up with a spiritual reason. That gets icky real fast. So for a nonprofit, it's probably investing a lot of their money into their services and their programs to begin with. So I would actually encourage them to invest quite a bit in their people. Nonprofits have notoriously high turnover. And so it's actually not good for the health of the organization or the people they serve to continue to burn people out. And then when it comes to where they're investing in those services, there's a lot of different ways to answer that. I mean, that also should be guided by the mission. Nonprofits can succumb to mission drift too, where they become more concerned about what donors want their services to look like than what the people they're there to serve need. So I would say that mission as anchor is really important for nonprofits. They are susceptible to blowing off course as well. All right, well, I think we should wrap up. Thank you.